Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Lauren Izo. Coming up in this edition, the countdown begins until Israel's vaccines wear off. The country's top COVID official says we may not have enough for the next round. As new talks kick off in Vienna, a mysterious attack on Iran's biggest nuclear facility. Could the Mossad be behind it? And Israel's judokas take silver and bronze at the European Championship in Lisbon. As the rest of the world is fighting the most difficult battle since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, Israel seems to be in another world altogether. Just when we were getting used to the idea of wearing masks wherever we go, now we won't have to, at least for the time being, until the cycle starts again. Hannah Rifkin reports.
Around the world, cases and deaths are continuing to increase at worrying rates. Globally, the number of new cases per week has nearly doubled over the past 2 months. This is approaching the highest rate of infection that we have seen so far during the pandemic.
But here in Israel, that is simply not the case. Beginning on Sunday, the country is virtually back to normal. Israel is lifting COVID restrictions that require wearing a mask outdoors, but wearing masks in closed spaces will remain mandatory. In addition to reversing the mask mandate, children are returning to their, quote, normal routines on Sunday. The Education Ministry announcing over the weekend that students could return to full-time schooling, 6 days per week, without capsules, and with no restriction on the movement of teachers, aides, or students. Infections continue to drop, apparently because of the country's successful and quick vaccine campaign. On Saturday, Israel's health ministry recording only 82 cases, with an infection rate of 0.8%. There are 126 Israelis in critical condition. Also, a coronavirus variant from India has been detected in Israel for the first time. The health ministry saying the strain was found among 7 unvaccinated travelers who returned to Israel from abroad. It was not specified where the 7 arrived from. India is currently battling a widespread surge in infections, with experts suspecting the most likely cause is the presence of more infectious variants, including the one detected in Israel. Israel's coronavirus czar, Professor Nachman Ash, said in an interview over the weekend that Israel is not yet in the clear and herd immunity will take time. He also said he was concerned about the Indian variant. Ash said, "We need to reach about 75% of the population having been vaccinated and or recovered to reach herd immunity. But we are seeing low morbidity data." Meanwhile, the CEO of Pfizer estimating that it could just be a matter of months until the population will need to be revaccinated.
A likely scenario is that there will be likely a need for a third dose somewhere between 6 and 12 months. And then from there will be an annual revaccination. But all of that needs to be confirmed.
Hannah Rifkin, ILTV.
Pfizer has suggested an additional shot may be necessary 6 months up to a year after initial vaccination. It's been roughly 4 months since Israel's prime minister was the first in the country to get vaccinated. That means in just 2 months, green passports may start to expire and Israelis may have to get revaccinated. Are we going back to square one? Let's ask Professor Nadav Davidovich from the Department of Health Systems Management at Ben-Gurion University. Thank you for joining me today, sir.
Thank you. We are definitely not back to square one. We have more and more data now, and probably we are going to extend even to 9 months, and I personally think even 1 year since a person had the second shot. We have more and more data both on the serology and also from clinical epidemiology that vaccines are very, very effective. What maybe should be more in our preoccupation is that there are more and more variants. We are following them. Until now, all vaccines are working against the variants, maybe some of them a bit less, such as the South African. But again, we see the situation now in Israel. I think it's amazing just to think what was here several months ago. and we are still following. But again, I think that at least it will be for 1 year. And the question of variants is still open. And this is why Israel is negotiating with Pfizer, because if there be variants, vaccine will be less efficient or no efficient at all. Then with the messenger RNA technology, this can be adapted, and we need to prepare for the coming year. And maybe this will be like influenza, that every year will need a booster.
Nachman Ash said that he is worried that Israel doesn't have enough vaccines to implement a third vaccination on all of the population. Could that be possible? And if so, what do we do? What comes next?
I don't think this will be the situation. We have excellent relationship with Pfizer. I'm very sorry that the whole agreement, most of it is under secrecy. This is because of vaccine nationalism. But since Israel was chosen as a model country, I'm quite positive that finally the budget will be found. It's very sad that it became entangled with the political situation. But we are going to continue and vaccinate. Most important now, those who are over 50, there are still about 200,000 people. We have the doses for them. And for next year, I'm positive that we'll find the way to continue the agreement. It's also the interest of Pfizer, again, because we are a model country.
We've been hearing reports about a new Indian variant that's been found in Israel. How worried are we about this?
There are variants all the time. This is now what is called a variant under investigation. It's not even a variant under concern. When there are several mutations that are changing, especially the spike protein, the protein that is infecting the cells, and also the one that the antibodies, are working against it, then sometimes we can have differences in what we call variant of concern. This is still not the situation. There are still ongoing studies to see what is the efficiency of the antibodies, right, and if indeed it's changing something. For now, we still continue to do the surveillance, but I won't say it's something of concern yet.
Okay, Professor Davidovich, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. And those who are not vaccinated, it's saving lives. Please go and do it.
Well, amid a relatively quiet period between Israel and Gaza, tensions escalating over the weekend with not one but two rocket incidents. On Friday night, a rocket fired toward Israel from the Gaza Strip, landing in open territory. There were no reports of injuries or damage, but the launch did trigger red alert sirens in the surrounding communities. In response, Israeli aircraft hit a series of Hamas targets in Gaza, like a Hamas training camp and a factory producing cement to construct infiltration tunnels. One day earlier on Thursday, another rocket was launched from the Strip toward Israel, with no injuries or damage reported in that case as well. The IDF also responding with airstrikes on Hamas positions in the Strip. Let's move to Iran now. Well, actually to Vienna, where talks are underway to salvage the nuclear agreement made with Iran and global powers in 2015. After Trump famously exited the deal in 2018, the new Biden administration wants to revive it. But a U.S. delegation will not take part in the talks, since Iran has refused to negotiate with them after the U.S. withdrawal and reimposition of sanctions. Instead, European Union officials are chairing the meeting, with China present as well. There is apparently a U.S. delegation at a separate hotel overseeing from afar. Tehran's chief negotiator said on Saturday that a new understanding appears to be emerging. Well, just as talks kicked off in Vienna, Iran named who they believe is the man responsible for a recent explosion and power outage at its main Natanz nuclear plant. Officials named the perpetrator as Reza Karimi, saying that he fled the country before last week's blast went off. They also said the 43-year-old suspect was wanted by Interpol. Iran, on its part, says Israel is responsible for organizing the attack. Israeli media outlets have quoted unnamed intelligence sources as saying the country's Mossad spy service carried out the sabotage operation, but their involvement is unclear. Reserves Major Dan Fefferman is a fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute and an expert on Israel and Middle East security. He joins us now. Thank you so much for joining me, Dan.
Pleasure.
So let's start with the latest. Iran has released a photo of who they say is responsible for the attack on the Natanz nuclear facility. On the other hand, Israel has been accused of being responsible, and the timing with the nuclear talks in Vienna, is that a coincidence?
I don't think it's a coincidence at all. According to the Iranian state television, the man behind the attack, Reza Karimi, his photo was released, and they said he managed to flee the country shortly before the sabotage took place. It's actually the first time that Iranian authorities acknowledge that there was some kind of attack. They're saying there was an explosion that destroyed a few thousand centrifuges. Israeli reports are saying that it might have been some kind of cyber attack. It doesn't have to contradict here, because it could be that since Israel never took place and is allowing for deniability, Iran is scapegoating some individual, or if there was, as the reports hint, that there was some kind of Israeli involvement, this could be the person who collaborated. But honestly, we're probably not going to know, and it doesn't really matter who actually is responsible. It seems, obviously there's a lot of propaganda behind here. What's interesting is that the U.S. has not been overly critical of this so far. And this has to do with the timing. Either way, it definitely seems connected to the negotiations taking place right now in Vienna. And it seems to be an attempt to pressure Iran, to deter Iran, to maybe even actually slow down the program. There's two interesting scenarios I want to offer. And I've heard serious analysts offer both kind of scenarios as to the timing, as the coincidence. And one option is that Israel is working quietly behind the scenes to torpedo these talks, as some analysts think, that Israel is against any kind of talks that would leave Iran with any kind of nuclear capabilities. It doesn't trust Iranian compliance, and it wants to stick with the maximum pressure campaign introduced during the Trump administration. If this is the case, then Biden and the Biden administration, even though they have not criticized Israel publicly, are probably secretly furious with Israel. And the Europeans have been a little more open with their criticism. And then according to this scenario, Israel is going to continue to try to sabotage these talks, if it's Israel indeed behind these events, and try to get Iran to the point where it can't stay at the table. The other option is that the good cop, bad cop scenario, which I've seen other serious analysts raise, and that the U.S. is allowing Israel to conduct these kind of attacks with deniability, allowing Israel to be the bad cop in this scenario and to strengthen its hand and to raise the pressure. But either way, the timing does not seem to be coincidental.
So speaking of those nuclear talks, the U.S. is apparently at a hotel across the street from the one where the talks are taking place, since Iran has refused to include them. Do they have any input, and will their role in these negotiations grow at all?
Right. So the U.S. is going to be, it's across the street, and the Europeans are running kind of the mediator role in the meantime. And the issue now at hand is that Iran refuses to have the U.S. sit at the table so long as the U.S. does not drop the additional sanctions that were added during the Trump administration. I think the whole issue of the talks right now is how to get the U.S. and Iran back to the table, to some kind of framework. It is, even though there are some actors, maybe the Russians, maybe the Iranians themselves, certainly, who want the U.S. to have a less dominant role, it's going to be impossible to ignore the U.S.'s role in this due to their dominance over the global economy and financial systems. And so,
can you hear me?
And so for the U.S. Sanctions to be lifted, it's going to be critical to get the two back to the table.
Okay, well, we await some interesting updates from Vienna. Dan Fefferman, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Well, an unexpected visit by officials from Sudan to Israel will not take place after sources said Khartoum canceled the trip. Apparently, the delegation, including top security and intelligence officials, was set to arrive next week, and there was no explanation given for the cancellation. Last year, Sudan agreed to take steps toward normalizing ties with Israel in a deal brokered by then U.S. President Donald Trump's administration. This month, Sudan's cabinet voted to repeal a 1958 law to boycott Israel. It's unclear if and when a delegation will plan another visit. Well, over the weekend, the Tel Aviv municipality building lit up with flashing messages in Hebrew and Arabic in honor of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. The exterior of the building shone a bright purple as messages flashed to wish residents a Ramadan Kareem, the traditional greeting used during the holy month. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, only vaccinated individuals were allowed to attend Friday prayers at Al-Aqsa Mosque in honor of Ramadan, including hundreds of Palestinians from the West Bank. Thousands who did not have a vaccine certificate were turned away at the entrance to the compound.
دخلنا عندهم هناك وقالوا لنا ممنوع تدخلوا. بدنا التطعيمة، ورناهم التطعيمة، قال ما في تطعيمة، ما بدنا تطعيمة الحين، بدنا تشريح من الارتباط، تروحوا تمسكوا مع الارتباط وتجيبوا تشريح وتيجوا. واحنا الحين في ارتباط الحين ما في ارتباط لانهم لازم الارتباط يمسك معهم، احنا شو دخلنا؟ احنا جايين نصلي. ما بدهم يدخلونا، هاينا من الساعة 6 واحنا قاعدين هنا وهم يضحكوا علينا. يقولوا لنا يلا ارجعوا وروحوا ممنوع تدخلوا.
Moving on now, congratulations to Israel's judokas who took home a silver and bronze medal over the weekend at the European Championship in Lisbon. Tohar Butbul won a silver medal after making it to the final and losing his final in the men's under 73 kilogram category to his opponent from Kosovo. Shortly afterwards, Sagi Muki defeated his Bulgarian opponent Ivanov to win the bronze in the men's under 81 kilogram category. And a day earlier, Geffen Primo claimed another bronze medal for women under 52 kilos. Israel's President Reuven Rivlin writing on Twitter, "Thank you for making us so proud." Well, American late-night TV comedian Jimmy Fallon had a special guest on his Tonight Show, Israel. That's right, Fallon launched a social media competition on Twitter asking his followers to describe a movie badly. For example, one response read, quote, "Harry Potter, 11-year-old orphan gets kidnapped, sent to magic camp, and ends up murdering one of his counselors." The official @Israel account, which is run by the Foreign Ministry, responded too, but failing to note any movie or show in its response to Fallon, declaring simply, "Fauda meets Edward Scissorhands meets West Side Story."
Fauda meets Edward Scissorhands meets West Side Story. I love it.
The account tweeting after the segment aired, saying the movie they were referring to was, you guessed it, the 2008 Adam Sandler hit Don't Mess with the Zohan. As Israel continues to celebrate 73 years of existence, it's important to highlight something that has a history deeply intertwined with the nation and has evolved alongside it since the country's founding: modern Hebrew. Once an ancient, outdated language, Eliezer Ben Yehuda is the man who pioneered a modernization of the language into what it is today. But why was it brought back? And more importantly, why did it disappear in the first place? Ulpan Or CEOs and founders Yoel and Orly Ganor are here to give us some more insight. Hello, and thank you so much for joining me.
Hello.
So why did this language die in the first place? Why did it need to be resurrected? And why did Eliezer Ben Yehuda want to bring it back in the first place?
Well, as we know, after the exile, the Babylonian exile, Jews started using the Aramaic language, okay? It was in use for 70 years, and it even stayed in our Talmud, the main language of learning the Talmud. Then there was the Roman exile, which lasts till today, actually, and Jews were scattered around the world. Then Hebrew remained the language of liturgy, of prayers, and Mishnaic study. So actually, it ceased to be day-to-day conversational language. And Ben Yehuda, when he was born at the end of the 19th century, he was actually brought as a scholar of Judaism. So he went to yeshiva, he studied all the Talmudic studies and Mishnaic studies, but then he went to a secular school. By the way, his original name was Perelman, Yitzhak Perelman, known as Ben Yehuda because he changed his name. By the way, I was actually sort of forced to change my original name into Ganor because of Ben Gurion. He actually ruled that everybody who wanted to become an officer in the Israeli army had to change his name. So my Hebrew name is Ganor, previous name was Gamburg. Anyway, so Ben Yehuda, when he was exposed to the secular studies, he learned a lot about history and geography, and he was fascinated by the way Bulgaria was able to regain its national security and freedom. And he asked himself, why can't we do it for our own Jewish people? So he became actually captivated by this idea. He went to Europe, he studied a lot there, and one thing that happened, many people don't know this, he met a person from Palestine, and he was able to hold a full conversation in Hebrew. It fully convinced him that Hebrew could be revived as a national day-to-day spoken language. So when he arrived in Palestine, his main purpose in life, his objective, his mission was to revive Hebrew language. And that's what he did.
Interesting.
And actually what he did was kind of homeschooled his whole family.
Oh, wow.
There is a saying that when he was on the boat with his wife, Dvorah, that didn't know a word in Hebrew, he told her, the minute we get to Israel, to Palestine, we're going to speak only Hebrew. And that's what he did.
Wow. So who else was involved in reviving the language, and how exactly did they manage to do it?
Right. So it was a real changeover at that time. These were the people that were called the first Aliyah people. The people who came at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, sorry. So there was one very famous one, intellectual called Yitzhak Epstein. And Epstein, what he did was he built a whole concept of teaching Hebrew in Hebrew, what is done till this day in Ulpanim. And he did lots of research and built the method. Following him were Israel Belkin, David Yudelevich, Nissim Bachar. If there are people who live in Jerusalem, they know that there are many places called Bachar. And they're all about culture and things that are reviving the language.
We don't have much time, but I wonder if you could give me some examples of a few terms that were introduced to modern Hebrew, perhaps invented by Eliezer ben Yehuda or introduced from other languages, as an example of how different the modern language is from the ancient language.
Right.
Lauren, do you like ice cream?
Does anyone not like ice cream?
Okay, exactly. So one of the words that Ben Yehuda innovated is glida, in Hebrew, ice cream. It comes actually from Aramaic. Glida in Aramaic means frost. So he used that term and turned it into Hebrew. Another one is rakevet, meaning train. So he took the Hebrew root, rechev, okay, and made it like in a chain, rakevet.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Interestingly enough, Chernyakhovsky used a gamelet. Gamal in Hebrew is camel. So a caravan is gamelet, okay? Another word would be interesting because it's not Ben Yehuda's word, it's his son's, which is Orly.
The word aviron.
Ah.
Aviron comes from avir, air.
Right.
So aviron, the airplane, it courses the air.
Very interesting and logical examples and explanations. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, let's take a look at the weather forecast with our Chana Rifkin.
Hey Lauren, well, our desert heat waves circling back this week with warm lows and partly cloudy evening skies tonight in the 60s and 70s, or lower to mid-20s in Celsius. And then a major rise in temperatures tomorrow, with highs getting into the upper 90s and lower hundreds, the hottest we've had yet thus far in 2021, or 30s and 40s in Celsius. Make sure to drink lots of water.
Don't forget to stay hydrated. Thanks, Chana. And now, just before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. I don't know whose dog that is, but it's really, really, really cute. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.28 shekels to the American dollar and 2.62 shekels to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to visit the all-new and improved ILTV website at iltv.tv and subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates while you're there. I'm Lauren Izzo. Thanks for watching.